Okay, so let's get into the games. And as the first game today, I picked a game that is kind of interesting to me. So this is my good friend John Donaldson, I am is white, against Cam, who we have had on the show before. And I identified with this game personally because here John is, and he is playing someone who is technically a much lower rated player, but is finding it difficult. And I identify with that a lot because in my show with the road back to 2500, which I usually do at this time, but I'm now going to do Friday at 11 Eastern. In that show, I've talked a lot about how hard it is coming back, or just any times, playing in these modern tournaments where you have to beat players who are lower rated. In this case, John is 400 points higher, which means he has to score, I think, 9 out of 10 just to hold his rating. And when you look at how close this game is, you get a sense of how hard it is for John and players like myself to beat Cam 9 out of 10. When you look at this game, it seems like it's basically impossible. So let's take a look. And normally I have the person who submitted the game on the bottom, but I chose John this time. I'm sorry, Cam. I'm on John's side on this one. I identify with the struggle. Okay, so now F3 is what John plays, and it's got to be a mildly inaccurate. I'm going to call it that. It can't be terrible, but it also can't be the best move. Let's leave it at that, and we might come back to it. Of course, the more normal move is bishop e2. And so for Cam, one of the nice things for f3 is I'm not certain, but he probably was a little bit out of, it throws a little bit of a loop at black, like why f3 and why is it maybe a little bit dangerous? And we'll see John has some very highfalutin ideas for white here. So Cam, of course, could have played bishop g7. And so we're going to get this position. And rook c1. And queen a5, b3, rook fc8, and now bishop d3. And I did that kind of fast, but I feel that's a pretty natural progression from the opening. And bishop d3 is also weird because normally you would put it on e2. And to Cam's mind anyway, this has something to do with stopping or making f5 a little bit harder to play. Maybe, I don't know. In any case, maybe it also doesn't make that big of a difference. The drama about the bishop on d3 is that, when the knight comes to d7, it's going to tag the bishop on one of those squares, and so it's more loose than it would like to be. But okay, I feel like this is a good place to start. And I feel like Cam's next move walks into John's intentions. Let's look first at what black plays, and then we'll talk about maybe what black should have done. After a6, John went for the endgame, which is now forced because of knight b6. And I'm going to say that I like John's position here a lot. I like it a lot because we have, in a lot of ways, an extra piece. The king is an extra piece on d2, and the king on g8 is really going to have a hard time playing a role in the game. Now, the game's not even close to over, and we're going to get into it. But Cam doesn't make any notes here, but I thought this was a critical moment and that black should have played knight d7. After which, I think he is totally fine. And on knight d5, I think you should just go back. And there are a lot of games that the expert on the Accelerated Dragon, Eugene Perelstein, has played here. And the very instructive plan, really, which is maybe I will just take on d5. Maybe you'll get the two bishops. But I'm aiming for a position with a knight on d7 versus the bishop on d3. And Eugene's done some crazy stuff. He's done stuff like queen f8, h5. king h7, bishop h6, just to get the exchange of the dark squared bishops, and then and he takes on d5. So that shows the determination to get that kind of plan. Okay, so let's look at the endgame. Now, I thought one of the reasons I thought this game was so interesting was that even though John got what he wanted, things didn't go as easily as maybe they should have. All right. Now, John's first move is very thematic. First move from this position, and that is g4. And this might look strange. I do not think it is about stopping f5, though that's maybe a side benefit. What g4, to my mind, is about is actually keeping the black king pinned down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and show you guys a slightly different variation. So, for example, bishop e2, knight takes, queen takes, bishop g7, bishop d2, castles, queen e3. If you look up this position with Paul Karras as white, there are some very instructive games, instructive for me anyway, where later he's going to do a similar thing where we're going to go to some kind of ending and we're going to play things like g4 to crimp the black king and the king side. And it's very interesting, and it's going to come into play here too, where, excuse me, I don't want that one. We're going to get it here too, where white, if he has an advantage, is the king and, the grip onto the black king side. Now, that said, maybe there were better moves than g4, but let's leave it at g4. Rook a b8. And now another kind of critical decision. John goes back, and I spent a little time on here because part of me, for the most part, doesn't completely believe in the b5 break because that is really like it's in a lot of ways our side of the board because our king is an extra piece on that field. So I just going through my mind, rook c2 also looks possible and yada yada. But let's look at what happened. So knight c3, knight c5, bishop e2, and let's read Cam's notes. By the way, really great notes in a lot of games. So I don't always get to read the notes, but what I've done is I've put them up there for people to read on their own. And you can also get a flavor of, I think, how well a lot of people are really annotating their games. By the way, if you're interested in submitting the game and you're intimidated or want to have a sense of what it means, looking at the annotations and going through the games is a very good way to do it. And if you go back, these chess.com forums where the games are submitted, you can go back, I think years now, we have people's annotations. So it's a really great database. Okay, so let's read. He says, King f8. This is the first move that I really didn't know what to do. After the game, my opponent suggested b5, and that seems reasonable and logical. Okay, now King f8 also is at least a little bit logical, but you get a sense actually of how the king has grief, the black king. That's your problem piece in this position. And John said something to the effect, after the game, the post-mortem, that you can't just sit in these kinds of positions. So let's look at the variation. b5 takes. I do think white needs to take. Takes. And watch what he says. I thought this just lost a pawn, but if we continue a little further, bishop d7, knight c3, rook a8, and now it's a little bit of a grief. And then Cam writes, with some sort of weird balance. The bishop pair isn't too scary, and the knight must be worth something. Interesting. Okay. one thing I've done is I always organize the games into themes. And the first two games we're going to do today, this one and the next, are the question of the two bishop advantage in the endgame. And this is the first one where we kind of have to wonder about the bishops and how strong they are. Now, I want to say at my first glance, it looks to me like I'd rather be white. And it's not just the bishops, but the better king. And maybe, if black is going to say that he is equal here, there needs to be some kind of follow-up to rook c2. And one piece of practical advice I have is if you want to improve your chess, studying a position like this just by yourself is fantastic, because you'll really get a sense of what a real ending is, not just some ending where somebody's telling you, like, how do you win it or whatever, right? Or what's the best move. No, there's going to be lots of different ideas and lots of different plans in a position like this. And the first one is going to be, well, what does black do? I don't know. It's already kind of an interesting question. Now, obviously, he's gone down a good line already, and I don't mean to chastise. It's a pretty good line. I am doing the biggest analysis of my life. I'm on page, I don't know, I'm past page 30 of handwritten analysis. It usually doesn't go that long. But I just want to give a plug for the fact that if you do this kind of analysis, it will make you powerful. And I'm noticing it now, and I kind of wish I had done more of it earlier, so I'm chastising myself here as well. Okay, but the interesting thing, let me say about this, about king f8 versus b5, is really if you play b5 here, especially with white having the better king, you're already sensing that there's drama and that you need to do something about it. So so what I guess I'm saying is, if John tells you you need to play b5, it's because he feels there's a sense of urgency in the black position, because white is going to slowly put the crimp on the black king and the king side with moves like h4, h5. Okay, so here we go. h6, and now a move that I guess is inaccurate with b4. And one of the interesting things to me about this move b4, and I put myself in John's shoes, is that it feels that black has given us just way too much time and is just kind of sitting on his hands. And so it feels natural then to say to yourself, okay, h6 seemed weird, king f8 seemed weird, now it's time for me to hurt the guy, right? But yeah, one of the challenges is that to play a position like this, you need massive patience in how, in dealing with it. My first instinct is that rook c2 gives white a very nice advantage. Not even close to over or anything, of course, but it gives a nice advantage. Okay, so b4, knight d7, knight d5, and right, it feels like white is losing his mind a little bit, because it's not clear what knight d5 necessarily does, and at some point black really might want to take the thing on d5. So Cam writes that a5 would challenge the white setup, and again this would be a pawn sacrifice, and you would only do this, right, if you had come to the conclusion that there was urgency in the position. I definitely think white is better here, though, and the main reason is that the king is better. The pawn shimon, right? Pawn shimon, but the king is better. Okay, so John, though, has a moment of complacency, which feels a little bit in tune with the moves b4, knight d5. And this is why it's so tough to beat the low-rated players, because in a position like this, you can say to yourself, oh, I'm in control, everything's okay, yada, yada. And he needs to play something like rook c2, and b6 lulls John into a sense of complacency, because he's like, well, what is black doing? And then I'm sure he missed a5. And now all of a sudden, the position isn't so easy, because if you play a3, and a3 is the only move to keep control over the c5 square, and maybe he shouldn't do it, but if he wants, if he wants to pursue this dream that he's been nursing, then that's the move to make. So f4 I also thought was unnecessary. We need to play rook c2. All right. So that's the problem. And now we're going to get this position. Now, bishop d5 definitely felt too early. Maybe it doesn't wreck anything, but there's also no rush in taking the thing. Okay. And here's John's idea. And notice what he did is he lost control of the position, but played a3 anyway, and saw this coming and decided this is the way to go to try to throw black off balance. And I definitely now would much rather be black. And the next coming moves are real interesting in that, right, I just want to say I love the black position. It's not just the beautiful passed a pawn, but we've got the blockade of the c5 square. And the bishop on e2 doesn't look great. The knight on d7 has squares. And in general, in this opening, I feel like what we're doing is we're trying to work against the bishop on e2. And very soon here, a bishop is going to show up on around c5, and we're going to demand that white give us his good bishop. And that's one of the key ideas in this opening. By the way, I'm spending way too long on this game. I'm spending way too long on this game. I got 18 games to cover, but I guess I'm having an idea with this show that I'll take one game and spend a little bit more time on it than the others, just to showcase one game. And I promise I'll get on with it here. Okay. Why can you not sit in these positions? Well, because John was going to play g4, f4, g5, and squeeze the life out of him. And if you want a great example, those Keras games from back in the day are pretty good ones. Okay, now bishop b4. This can't be bad if king c d1 is his best move. But one thing about it that I felt a little bit worried, if I can use that word, is that it felt to me like we are not seeing that bishop c5 is really where we want to go. We want to trade off that dark square bishop as, sooner rather than later. So bishop b4 isn't bad, and now things get weird. Now, black's move that he does is definitely a little bit creative, okay? And let's just look first what he does. And the idea is, to control the queening square, a1, and to sack the pawn. And here he probably does have, let's call it compensation, sure. But I think here he's better, so I think he should be doing better than compensation. And I think his fear is interesting here. Let's talk about it. So king g7, I feel like that's at least the right move from a human perspective. Bishop d4, f6 is what he writes, and then he said g5, and all of a sudden my king feels funny. Now, maybe it does. But here's an interesting point. Why not knight e5? That looks very strong to me. Very strong indeed. Because the bad news for white is that if he wants to survive this position, he can never give up the dark square bishop. So, very soon, well, we can do all kinds of things, honestly. But bishop c5, I assume, is coming. a4 is coming. And I don't see any play for white at all. Now, maybe I'm missing something, but yeah, I just don't see it. So I think the prejudice was the pinned piece and maybe like the bishop e5 de structure. But I want to stress that is fantastic for black because you own the blockading squares with c5, and this bishop is a golden goose that really, if you could sack a pawn to get that bishop, I think, well, we might. In fact, let me just check myself when I say that. So let's do a thought experiment. Say here, would I give up this pawn to trade off this bishop? That's an interesting thought. Black would definitely be better, much better. Okay, well, let's continue with the game. Bishop c3 was at least kind of clever from a positional standpoint. So we give the h-pawn, and of course it's a little scary now because white has a passed pawn on the h-file. And this is an interesting similar mistake. Now, it's not a mistake in the sense that when you played bishop c3, that was your intention, right? To keep the dark square bishop. And it's kind of evil, right? you got the a-pawn running down. But of course, as you write, bishop g7 was probably correct. And then the point is that you want to trade that thing, that dark square bishop. Okay. John now takes, and this is another interesting position for me with John's decision. He decides to go into the straight bishop ending, and maybe this isn't the best, but I think his notion is that if he does this, the a-pawn will be defanged. Like it'll be harder for black to push the a-pawn in a meaningful way. The rook, and this is just a bad situation, it's hard for the rook to deal with this guy, right, with this bishop here. So this is perhaps lazy, but it presents black with some interesting problems. Now, I'm sure black is fine here. And Cam writes bishop f6. Sure, I'm sure there's multiple things you can do. There's really not a lot of danger. But watch how John wins this thing. Yeah, watch how John wins this thing. And it has a little bit to do with the two bishops. And since it's the theme of this game, this ending, and the next one, let me just say something obvious about the two bishops. And maybe this is just too obvious for some people out there, but I think since it was something that I didn't quite grasp until much later, just maybe I grasped it intuitively, but I'd never just stated it out loud, was that when you take your standard bishop, let's put him here, right? And he controls 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I think if you put him on d4, it's even more. The knight can only control 8, right, at the most. Like the d7 knight controls 6 squares at the moment. So the bishops, once the board opened, are already stronger than the knight. The simple drawback of the bishop, though, is that it controls only half the board. You get a friend on the board, like bishop on f1, you're doing great. Now, there's an interesting problem for white. One of his bishops is dramatically better than the other. So we're going to see, though, that John puts his bishops to work, the bishop on the light square bishop to work in a great way. So black messes around a little bit, and the knight should definitely go to c5. And all of a sudden, it's getting a little creaky here for black, because it's not just, we're going to see that John's going to be attacking the a-pawn, but he's also going to be dreaming of an invasion. And so things fall apart here kind of dramatically quickly. King a4 and bishop d1. And notice there's just a simple thing here that if white wants to play bishop c2, we're stopping the a-pawn moving, or at least dissuading it from moving. And then after bishop c2, we're going to be threatening things like h6 and h7. Notice no bishop a5, because that would just lead to a completely drawn opposite color bishop's position. Right? What am I saying? That would be trading. We'd be trading, but it would be similar in the sense that the knight is controlling the dark squares against the bishop on d1, and we'd rather get rid of our light square bishop with bishop takes a4, which, you look at it, it's hard to get out of this. So king b5, let's call that an exclam move. Bishop d1 exclam, and king c6, definitely an exclam move. Blunder, I guess, but boom, now it's over. It ended remarkably quickly. So, John ends up showing his class at the end, and to me, a remarkable game. I actually feel like I've had a lot of games that are very similar to this, and some of them I didn't win, some of them I lost too, where really, like, when you think about John's mistakes, they were kind of hard to see even, like, and that a3 move that he did, well, I wasn't even necessarily a mistake. That was a practical decision to gambit the pawn, and it actually worked out, So let's say he had a moment of complacency, and that's what got him into into the situation. And I've been there, and the moves that Cam did kind of lulled him into that. I'm going to say king f8, h6, b6. John, I'm just hanging out. I'm not doing anything. I'm your friend, and so it's funny, like what John was saying about the sense of urgency that Black needed to see. It was kind of rebounded on him because he disrespected his opponent for not sensing that lack of urgency, and then himself pushed a little bit too hard when he needed to consolidate, I feel, with moves like rook c2.